We come to the second presentation, and we're arranging presentations as if they were resonances in a set. And we're going to seal this set of presentation resonances with a harmonic that creates then a scalar. It creates, in this case, a 12-part scale sealed by a 13th presentation into a harmonic scale. This allows for us to do a number of relational high wire acts with the way in which our understanding has come to different but related focuses. If we simply have lectures or we simply have events, then there's an arithmetical, that arithmetic quality is like counting. And this is basic, it's fundamental, but counting, arithmetic, an arithmetical quality only allows you a certain number of operations. You can add, you can subtract, you can multiply, you can divide, and you can even bring in distribution, but you cannot bring in the million other operations that are capable in a mathematic that is not there in an arithmetic. Even in an arithmetic, you can have a cardinal sequence and you can have an ordinal sense of the powers of that sequence. But this is literally grade school. We're looking at a quality of our species that has been mathematically alert for several thousand years and has in fact mastered the application techniques of very high mathematics for at least 300 years. We're looking at the way in which a refinement of our qualities as beings went through this kind of refinement about 50,000 years ago, and that our species, when it was introduced about 200,000 years ago, was an incredible refinement. And the core of that earliest refinement was the ability for the neural structure of our physiology to adjust in a micro way the whole aspect of breathing. In order to speak like I am speaking, and you can as well speak, we need to neuronally modify our breath about at least 60 times per second to be able to get the right shading and tones and enunciation to have what we just simply call speech. There is a higher refinement of speech so that many aspects of the speech now are layered into a kind of a parfait. And this introduces then something other than speech, and it introduces the complex cadence, the cadence that can be complexified, and this results in myth. The ability for a storyteller, for a myth maker to operate is that they must get into the cadence of the mythic horizon. When I was teaching in Canada, I pioneered a course called World Mythology in Calgary, Alberta. And I also pioneered having the course half the time at the university and half the time at the Indian Friendship Center in downtown Calgary, where not only were there about 90-some people in the course, but from all of the Algonquin tribes, especially the Blackfoot, the Stoney, many other tribes, came to the Friendship Center, and we had crowds of sometimes 300 or 400 people. And there I would bring myth makers, storytellers from the tribes to deliver in their own Algonquin language the myths which later would be translated by one of their younger relatives. The first one's name was Hanson's Bearpaw. He was blind. He was in his late 70s, early 80s, and he had a storyteller's cane. I, at the time, received a storyteller's cane from one of my African students from Cameroon. And I'll bring it one of these times to show you. Once he got into the cadence, the ribbon-like flow of the myth coursed through the hearing in the room. Everyone had ears to hear, but only the native peoples could understand the language. And many of the native peoples, the younger ones, could not understand the language. Once Hanson's Bearpaw got into that flow, that mythic horizon of speech created an energy form. It was like a tuning of the frequency of the energy. And you could palpably feel that you were carried along on the waveform of the energy of the storyteller, of the myth maker. Later, when one had heard a number of myths and had read some of them in books, had heard some of them in speech discourse, you began to get a comparative quality that there is something massively understandable behind the whole phenomenon of what was being talked about. That the world of things, that the world of our actions had a hidden quality to it that could be brought forth by showing that the appearance of things is only the base of the energy, and that the deeper base is that existence, existentiality, is a phenomenon within a field, and that that field is a mystery. And that mystery is really what nature not only is, but that nature occurs mysteriously before anything is, so that it occurs before actuality or existence comes into being, comes into play. This engenders then a complexity of structure, of understanding that results in symbols that now take all of the images, all of the feeling tones, all of the things of the world and the actions of what happens in the world, and knits them together into a very complex factory of endeavor that comes to focus in ideas. And that those ideas have at their center symbols that act as if they were the nucleus of a structure that has a wide-ranging energy pattern around it. And in this way, the symbolic structure of the mind is very much like an atom. It has a nucleus at the center of its structure, but the action of the qualities of its complexification are in the electrons that surround the nucleus. And just as the nucleus can now be complexified and enlarged, the electrons become enlarged in a very interesting way. They get to where they saturate a certain energy level, and one more electron will not go into that energy level, but a new energy level appears, like a magician. And that next level will have an increase of twice as the number of electrons. The first shell, which is an energy registry, will take 8. But the second will take 16. The third will take 16. Then, all of a sudden, you have a quality where the electrons will not fit in those first three. They'll go to a fourth shell, which will take 32. One begins to understand that by looking at the energy registry of the electrons, we were able to go into a refinement from something that seemed unrefinable for several thousand years. That was the atom. The atom was first posited by Democritus in Greece some 2,400 years ago. But it was only about 100 years ago, in fact, 1897, when the electron was detected as a subatomic particle. It was the first one. There was a commemorative book called Electron, a Centenary Volume, put out by Cambridge University Press in 1997 to commemorate 100 years of the first subatomic particle. The fact was that when you looked at the structure of an atom in a more refined way, you saw that what counted was that the energy level of its extension was the key to how it would behave as an element that now had a structure. It is the electrons that determine the properties of a material, the properties of an element. And it took quite a while. It took more than 15, 17 years for someone finally to come to understand there must be then a structure of the atom where there are many subatomic particles. And the first person to understand that in a very deep way was a man named Ernest Rutherford. And Ernest Rutherford was born in New Zealand. He was born on the South Island in Nelson. His father was a flax farmer. His mother, just a regular housewife. When he went to university first, he went to a university in Nelson, New Zealand that had 80 students total. He ended up being one of the greatest geniuses of all time in the new refinement of our species, because he is the first person to be able to understand that there is a structure to the atom that can be discerned individually in particles, and that they all relate together in such a way that somehow the ensemble of it is the atomic structure of all existent materiality. He went on to point out that the atom is incredibly small. The ink in the dot ending a sentence in any book has a billion atoms in just that much ink. So the atom is incredibly small, but the atom is largely void open space. The nucleus is so tiny compared to the size of the atom as an atom that if you had an atom the size of a football field, the nucleus would be a pea on the 50-yard line. The electron is many times smaller than the nucleus, and yet it determines the qualities of all material in the universe. And if you take one electron away from a complexity of many electrons and many protons and neutrons at the nucleus, that atom now is not the element, it is an isotope of the element. Just one electron can do this. The relationship of the electrons to each other determines the way in which atoms can come together and form molecules. So that now we have an insight. And Rutherford was one of the first people to understand this because he had a wild talent. He was able to build his own instruments. his own equipment. He could machine, he could manufacture, he could blow the tubes. He could literally put the lab together himself and could associate himself with others like himself, so that one of the first labs in the world that began to really be like a scientific lab was when he went to Cambridge University. He was in his 20s, and he began to work at the Cavendish laboratory in Cambridge. And the Cavendish had been under the charge of J.J., J.J. Thomson was the one who had discovered the electron. And he had been in charge of the Cavendish, but he was a Butterfingers man. And anytime he touched equipment, he would break it. And he could not make it. He couldn't mill. He couldn't work the lathe. So they said, why don't you think about these things and tell us what you're thinking about, and we'll do the experiments, we'll build the equipment, don't touch it. When J.J. Thomson finally retired, by that time Rutherford had taught in Canada at McGill in Montreal, had gone back to England to Manchester University, and he was hired to replace J.J. And when Thomson left and Rutherford came, all of a sudden the Cavendish Laboratory became an active center, the greatest in the world, of the next refinement of chemistry and of physics in the world. And in fact, Rutherford was given the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1908 for his realization that radiation consists of three kinds of rays, and that the most powerful ray they were working with, the alpha particle ray, that those alpha particles were actually ionized helium atoms. That radiation was not some mysterious energy, but it was the energy of ionized helium atoms working as if it were a wave ray. And one of the very earliest men to understand the significance of this was a very young Dane named Niels Bohr. And Niels Bohr made a beeline from Copenhagen, where his family was honored for generations and centuries, went to Rutherford's lab, and the two of them together by 1912, 1913, about in that time, gave the first idea of what a structured nuclear electron orbiting atom would be like, and that this was the key to the use of radiation to transmute the structure of elements, not simply to change the atoms so that they would make new kinds of molecules, but to change the atoms so that they were atoms of a different material. And one of Rutherford's last books is, in fact, the very last book he did, is called The Newer Alchemy, published in 1937 by Cambridge University Press. And it was a Sedgwick Memorial Lecture from 1936, November. The book was published in February of 1937, and a couple of months later, Rutherford suddenly died. He was in the best of health, but he died from what was diagnosed later as a strangled hernia. That literally almost like a heart attack, but grabbing his whole metabolic system, and he died. It was an enormous event because Rutherford was the author of the first book in the world on radioactivity. He published it in 1904. Cambridge University Press sold out the first edition so quickly they had to prepare for a second run, and Rutherford, being the kind of man he was, said, well, wait a minute, we have done much more work in a couple of months so that the second edition was larger and more complex in May of 1905, some 7 months later. This is the second edition of Radioactivity. By the time he had 4 more years, in 1913, he put out a completely new edition. He said, we're not talking about radioactivity, we're talking about radioactive substances and their radiations. So by 1913, he was able to step this up in such a way that in just a handful of years, literally less than a decade, went from the ability to do the first textbook on radioactivity to being able to assess now that this was a universal phenomenon about energy and about the structure of the atom. And that if one pursued the opening of the petals of this flower of shared insight, because by this time Rutherford had made it apparent that it isn't one genius who makes these advances, it's the human being who is able to engender the dear confidence of others of the same ilk to put all their petals together and to make a flower of a place. And that there's no limitation to the nationality, to the gender, to the age, to the religion of those who participate in that kind of a flower matrix of endeavor. That community is a searching community that is blessed by the universe, allows them to see beyond the veils of her dance, to see that the dance of the energy waves is able to be looked through with a new kind of vision, that nature is mysterious, has the mysteriousness of a feminine. One can know of her literally forever and never penetrate her mystery. But there is a complementary field that has an extra dimension from nature, and that is consciousness, differential consciousness. We call it, in my work, vision. It's a much easier way to begin, because consciousness is really the ecology of further dimensions of consciousness. And so vision is the first phase of 4, just like there are 4 dimensions that come integrally out of the field of nature. There are 4 dimensions that radiate out of the field of consciousness. So that consciousness is a dimensional field that has a masculine kind of tone, in that nature accepts, so that the field of consciousness and the field of nature together make a fertility of transmutations, of transformations. And so one says in the old alchemy that there is something not only essential in the world, there's something quintessential in the spirit that is able to enter the world and bring about transforms. And that nature welcomes this, welcomes it as her mystery partner in making a further mystery, like a double mystery, that now what is made new transformationally will be fertile. It can continue to occur. It is not only phenomenal, but it has a numinous quality. So we say of it now that transformation forms are numinous, and the study of them is numenology, not phenomenology. And that the numenology and the phenomenology hold together, they sync together as if they were a new kind of entwining, so that the fabric of existentiality, the fabric of actions, the tapestry of karma and existence now has a different weave to it. The French coined a beautiful description of such a fabric. It's a jacquard fabric. It can show two different weaves in the same fabric. One can look at it, it's not just an optical illusion, it is an angle of vision that allows you to see this same fabric now has two different ways to be seen. It is the same fabric. And through complexification of transformation, one can then develop weaves that have not just two, but many ways of being seen, all at different angles of vision, all in the scintillation of light. And so there is a quality of the dearness of transforms when they become fertile, but those transforms will not stay in the integral structure of the mind. They shy away from being put there and left there. They yearn for the freedom and the variety that is the fuller spectrum of their numinous actuality. So that there is a deep quality then for those who have had their individuality transformed. They do not want to stay in the structure of what was determined that they were, because they now have capacities other than what they were, and they yearn for the freedom, they yearn for the variety that they know is their heritage. It is as real a heritage to them as the existence is to those who are based on phenomenon. Those who are based on noumenon have a different quality. They're not individuals. They are whole spectrums of possibility. And so we say of them they are spirit persons. And that those spirit persons operate in a new expanded naturality. They operate as if the array of possibilities is now prismatic, we would say. So that the spiritual person, like a prism, is able to diffract the light into its rainbow. So that right away one begins to recognize that even in ancient times, the new capacity of special persons recognized the rainbow as the new transform symbol for a new type of person. And of course, when we look for the first time when the rainbow was used in this way, we find it in the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. And the first person who has this capacity is Noah. And when he survives the flood with his ark coming to rest on Mount Ararat, and Mount Ararat is not only one large peak, there's a little Ararat next to it. And if one were just about 30, 40 miles away from Ararat, that would be the capital of Armenia called Yerevan. If you went on the other side of Mount Ararat, you would be in Turkey. The quality of Noah surviving and starting a new kind of lineage in humanity, the covenant God makes with him is the rainbow covenant, the first. He says, I set my bow in the sky. It's not on earth, but it is the ark in the sky that makes a tuned symmetry with the transcendental quality of the earth, so that those two parts of the rainbow that arches through the sky, where it touches the earth, the mythology of the leprechauns is that's where the pots of gold are. That means that's where the collection of the transformed elements are. That the earth then is blessed in that way, and that a man or a woman who is able to live by that rainbow covenant, is able to determine where those rainbows occur, invisible to others but visible to themselves, and wherever the symmetry of earth being touched by the arc and the arch of that rainbow in the sky, these are propitious places where transformed energies can be sustained and not lost. The quality from the first edition of Radioactivity in 1904 through its transform in 1913, by 1930, radiations from radioactive substances replacing all of the earlier literature, and this became one of the great classics of world history. The co-authors, James Chadwick and C.D. Ellis. It was quite interesting to realize that Chadwick really was quite an exceptional figure. He started working in 1922 with Rutherford, and it was James Chadwick who discovered that there are not only protons and electrons, but that there are neutrons. He's the discoverer of the neutrons, 1932. It made a huge difference because now one could see the refined symmetry of not only protons and electrons, positive and negative, but that there was a neutral, that the neutrons were neutral, that with a three-quality, a three-pronged structure, as it were, it revealed that there are other energies that are also as real as electricity. And that electronics is only one variety of the use of energy in a much more complex universe. And the first energy to be understood was spin. The very first book bringing out spin is from one of the great physicists, Sin Ituro Tominaga, published by the University of Chicago Press. Tominaga was a very close friend of Richard Feynman. And this was published in 1997 as part of the centennial for the discovery of the electron. Now spin is capable of having a usage just like electricity, so that there are sparticles, not just particles. And here from physics.phys.org.com, April 30th, 2007, new materials for making spintronic devices. So that in addition to electronics, we now have spintronics. We now have the ability to have a whole different family, echelon of application of energy. And yet, the insight is there that there is a third kind of energy, a third kind of frequency, because the electron has not only charge and spin, but it has a third quality that is so peculiar it's called strangeness. And no one yet knows how to apply strangeness to technology, but we will. So that in addition to electronics and spintronics, there will be strangetronics sometime in the 21st century very soon. A more complex, complete way of understanding that energy is a weavable materiality, and that it can weave in such a way that you don't just get a fabric or even a complex fabric, but you get an almost infinite complexity to whatever fabric you wish to wear. And so our species is refining itself again to star wisdom man. We have had this as a seed for about 2,500 years. We've had it as a workable possibility for the last 2,000 years. And we have inherited over the last 300 years a speeding up of the ability to accept this by opening the mind, by opening the symbolic structure in a classic wisdom way, by making the symbols transparent so that the light of insight is able to come through from the field of conscious visioning, which now we call theory. Theoria, Greek, means contemplation. The theoria can peer from the field of vision in through the structure of the open mind with the transparent symbols and look at the phenomenal referentiality. Look at the procedural details of the actions and their specific steps and modify them, put them into variance, and even open them into freedom. Now the world rejoices in a peculiar way. Mother Nature, as a field of mystery, falls in love with her new children. She adores that they have grown up enough to leave home and explore new worlds and yet regard her with respect when they come back to visit. And as the old folk wisdom was, it's wonderful to have the kids home for the holidays. Let's hope they go back out and leave us some quiet. Let's take a break. Let's come back. This was a cover of Nature, which is the planetary journal of science for several million people around the planet. And its cover featured Choosing a Future. And we know now that part of the future has been chosen. One of the most peculiar things about the future is that it is both mysterious and conscious, and that the conscious aspect of it is differential, so that it is not knowable in reductive ways at all, ever, but can be discovered. And in fact, one of the seminal little books published in the world was entitled The Discovery of the Future by H.G. Wells, and he published it in this little book in 1913. He published it exactly at the time that Rutherford's and Niels Bohr's model of the atom was first being made, and Wells was in a special position at the time. He had, at the same time as the discovery of X-rays and the electron, written one of the most peculiar books of all time. It was called The Time Machine. And this little book, this is a first edition of H.G. Wells's The Time Machine. Published, this is the New York edition. The English edition was published by someone else. And this is dated 1895. The Time Machine and an Invention. What's significant here is that time is the fourth dimension when you're working with an integral symbolic structure. But as soon as you go into nature, time in the field, in the mystery field of nature, is the first dimension. Because time makes movement phenomenal. And it's only movement being phenomenal that allows for space in its three dimensions to blossom instantaneously, it seems, out of time being timely. So that in the field of nature, time is the first dimension. In the field of that time nameless. Because its phenomenality is an open spectrum. The word for it is that it is infinite. There are infinite scalars of time. But one of the first things that happens is that because time now has woven into it the conscious transform of the visionary field, not only is nature now fertile for many different kinds of times, in fact, infinite scalars of time, it does a special kind of a do-si-do with the symbolic structure of the mind. And in the symbolic structure of the mind, the imagination as a structural organizer, the image base becomes organized by the imagination and directly helps the forming of ideas, so that images and ideas are related in the sense that the image base, when selected out, allows for it to be arranged in integrals that are centered by symbols. And that an idea is like the nuclear symbol and image base arranged in a certain way so that it becomes like an atomic structure in the symbolic mind. And because there are different ways to do this, different ideas, the mind actually in its structure has like different elements, each one distinct by its symbol, idea, intercaling, image base that is selected, and the imagination to bring it together as a phenomenon. So that one actually has the ability to have a clear idea, very specific clear idea. In fact, many clear specific ideas. And one of the earliest indications of this is the ability to count. One, as an idea, is very specific. 1. 2 is a correlate idea, also very specific. So that counting now is the ability to array in an integral order, in a cardinal order, numbers 1 through 9, and that 10, the very next number, will have a jump in the scalar, so that 10 will be not some different kind of written number, but will be 1 again with a 0 written with it. So that 10 is an order of 1. And if you go through 99, 100 will be the second adding of an order, it'll be the third order, and so on. So that the zeros now are integrated into the counting as steps in the arithmetical arrangement, not based on tens so much, though one can speak that way, but it is based on filling the numbers all the way through the ordering. In the first 9, there are 9 places before you get to 10, but in 100, there are 99 places before you get to 100. So that the principle of atomic structure holds that numbers become the electrons, as it were, of the 0, which is really the bulk of the structure of the phenomenon. Most of the atom is empty space. The P on the 50-yard line. The electron being the glint off a beer can in the stands. And yet, those minuscule doping of voids create material, create existence, create atomic structures that hold, and they hold in such a way that one cannot estimate very accurately the lifetime of a proton. There are new protons that have come into manifestation in the universe, but it's very difficult to think of a proton's lifetime where it would have exhausted its phenomenality. So we're looking at a very mysterious nature, at a very protean consciousness as dimensions that can come together in such a way that they form a complementarity. They form a whole, and that the whole is not limited to a sphericality, although one metaphorically talks about spheres ever since the time of Pythagoras about 2,500 years ago. Because the sphericality was understood to be the essence of the phenomenal shape of the sun, of the moon, of the morning or evening star, Venus, of very sharp-eyed people, of being able to see that, in fact, Mars has a sphere, that Jupiter has sphericality, and by the time of the 1500s, the 16th century, it was understood that all the planets, the sun and the moon, and certainly the Earth, are spheres. Pythagoras' early harmonic was that the spheres together, collected, have a music because they are the octave of that music. A number of years ago, the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Lab, the people under Ed Stone working with the Voyagers, Voyager 1 and 2, found through the instrumentation of the Voyagers that as each planet moves through the stellar medium of the solar wind and so forth, the bow shock of the fields of the planets actually has a sound. And they made a little whistle. I have it someplace at home. That's the sound of our planet with its bow shock moving through the solar system's wind. And that one can actually sound electronically the sound of each of the spheres of the planets and the moons and so forth, so that there is literally a music of the spheres of a star system. And our star system has a very complex and yet a very interesting kind of harmonic to it. It will have 4 planets and then it will have an asteroid belt. It will have 4 big planets and a very big asteroid belt called the Kuiper belt. So it has like a 1-2 sequence of waves. The first one, quite substantial. The second one, enormous compared to it. And that as this entire system moves through the interstellar medium, it also has, the star system itself has a bow shock in the interstellar medium. And that one is able now, in our kind of refined emergence, to be able to understand something which I, at one time, called interstellar learning. A whole 2-year program, 104 90-minute presentations on DVD of how it is that we come to understand, at long last, a capacity which we have been engendering for a very long time and is now coming to a harvest. It's begun a long time ago. It was given a brilliant refinement 2,000 years ago, and that in the last 300 years it's been progressively refined to where now we have something, the last statement of it was the learning civilization. And the outline is 100 pages just to give a précis of what it is and how to do it. And it's available. Where does this begin? For me, it begins with this little book, Flash Gordon and the Red Sword Invaders. It's the first book I wrote my name in, and it was published in 1945. I talked last week about ramming a pencil through my right hand and at 7 months and awakening. The curious thing is, it's not an accident. The place in my hand where the pencil went through and the scars are still there is, if you took a map of the state I was born in, Michigan, the city I was born in is right where the hand of Michigan is, exactly where the pencil went through my hand. When I was a preemie, I was a 7-month baby, so the second 7 months gave me a rebirth, shove, get out there and do your stuff. I learned to read at 3. I didn't know I was learning to read. I remember sitting on my father's lap. He was reading a comic book to me. I think I still have that Red Ryder comic book from 1943. And I said, well, why didn't you read this? He was reading out loud to me. He said, well, how do you know I didn't read that? I said, well, it says this and you didn't say that. So I knew that I could read. And so by the age of 4, I was able to read my own material. And my own material was all about things that included iconic images, like this illustration of a rocket going in the sky past the Capitol dome of Washington, D.C. This appeared for the first time in Flash Gordon comic books in the early 40s, and that same image was used in one of the greatest science fiction movies of all time, The Day the Earth Stood Still, where the UFO went over the Capitol, and they just remade in 2008 The Day the Earth Stood Still. A little bit of prose that I read when I was 4. I must rush your war plans to Washington, said Major Danver. Flash smiled and said, well, we'll pick up Dale and Zarkov and be there in an hour by stratosphere. It's a couple of 1,000 miles. The major shook his head. Only an hour? They picked up Dale and Zarkov, and soon the nation's capital, witness of many developments in a swiftly changing world, beheld another as Flash Gordon guided the Earth's first war rocket over the Capitol dome. The officials swiftly assembled to inspect the strange new defense weapon. While Zarkov went into conference on production problems, Flash explained his rocket to military, naval, and civilian experts. They were amazed and astounded at his claims and curious to learn for themselves. I remember at this time not only reading this particular book, but I was still a boy playing with my trucks on the living room rug. My mother was ironing. Not all Americans were rich. She was ironing in another part of the living room, and the radio was on, and I heard an interview where a man was talking about the nuclear reactions that were about to be released, and maybe a chain reaction would set the whole atmosphere on fire. And I remember going over with one of my little trucks in my hand and asking my mom, ironing, what's a chain reaction? And she didn't know. And I remember setting the truck down and realizing there were intensely important things that my mother doesn't know about. Who knows? How can one find out? It is this kind of equality that introduces the Homo sapiens stellaris, the star wisdom man dimension, into someone's life. You begin to sense that not only is there more, it is discoverable. H.G. Wells, in The Discovery of the Future, published in 1913 because he was, by that time, one of the most famous writers in the world. It will lead into my subject most conveniently to contrast and separate two divergent types of mind. Types which are to be distinguished chiefly by their attitude towards time, and more particularly by the relative importance they attach and the relative amount of thought they give to the future. The first of these two types of mind, and it is, I think, the predominant type, the type of the majority of living people, is that which seems scarcely to think of the future at all, which regards it as a sort of blank non-existence, upon which the advancing present will presently write events. The second type, which is, I think, a more modern and much less abundant type of mind, thinks constantly and by preference of things to come, and of present things mainly in relation to the results that must arise from them. The former type of mind, when one gets it in its purity, is retrospective in habit. It interprets the things of the present and gives value to this and denies it to that entirely with relation to the past. The latter type of mind is constructive in habit. It interprets the things of the present and gives value to this or that entirely in relation to things designed or foreseen. What is being presented here is a third way, third stream music. The future and the new past are related together in a deep complementarity, not around a present point, a present moment, but arranged in symmetry around a shimmering presence, and that presence is recognizable, is rememberable, and most importantly, is shareable. Persons who can presence together. And this is a basis of community that is personal and spiritual and not limited by the mind's structure, but takes advantage of the mind in its integral structuring by giving it a neutral gear where it can be transparent, through which the future can enter into the presence and the past can change in its variety and freedom. And one great example of this is from Science Daily. This was January 6, 2009. It's even hard to say 2009. It's so new. Headline: Astronomers to gaze back in time and map the history of the universe. Because NASA, with the Spitzer Space Telescope, is so future perfected as an instrument, it's able to see deeper into the universe. And by deeper, one goes back into time and recovers a past time that was 13 billion years ago, now in such a way that the future unfolding of it is showing us a structure of a cosmos that is increasingly beautiful in its mysteriousness, but knowable in its inquiry of infinite interest. The future and the new past. The prismatic spiritual person is a refined instrumentality of individuality that allows for the opening up, either personally or in communities of persons of any number, of any complexity, to inquire together, to discover together, and to reclaim by transformation together whatever pasts there were into new pasts that can be rewoven instantly into a more interesting kind of a fabric of life. So that the earth is no longer a colored map of kingdoms and empires, isn't just a globe of opportunity, but is a planet and a whole scalar of planets that makes a star system which has a relationship across the interstellar frontier to stars without end. Our galactic structure has 2 trillion bodies that hum in the mediums. It is this quality that introduces what a famous science fiction writer, friend of mine, Theodore Sturgeon, called the touch of strange. It isn't the touch of the electricity, positive and minus. It isn't yet even the future touch of spintronics, but it's the touch of strange. That other quality of the atomic structure. Sturgeon, who is a very close friend, signed this on the title page to Roger Weir with deep appreciation of his strange touch. Theodore Sturgeon. Sturgeon was famous, and will be forever, of one of the most incredible novels ever written called More Than Human. It won the International Fantasy Award in 1954. It's about 6 dysfunctional human beings. One of them is a mongoloid idiot in a crib. 2 are twins, young black girls who can teleport things. A village idiot who has seemingly an IQ of about 50 who can do telepathic acrobats. And together they make a new gestalt being. They make a new kind of being. The first edition in hardcover, More Than Human, got this playful kind of signature from Theodore Sturgeon. It is no rumor that Roger Weir is more than human. It's true. This quality of being able to be at home in a cosmos that is no longer science fiction is in fact such a new integral part of the differential spectrum of weaving that young nephews consider space travel and science fiction old stuff, and they're looking at new ways to do this. We need to go by dimensional attraction, Uncle Roger. Forget all the rockets. Here's a phrase in a couple of pithy sentences to give us a paragraph. The mind-centered world is a materialist parfait called mental. There, the mental enclosure of the worlds finds a structure which it considers its grand self. All and everything can be stacked and coded into file by data, and the frame of 4-dimension pictures a certainty of definition. Thus, the appearances that play in illusion are referented and integrated at last into a delusion, if believed exclusive and acted out, man exhibits madness. The entire ecology of consciousness is higher dimensions arrayed with a differential, not an integral scalar, and all of this is missed because the beginnings of it are co-opted by the mentality as if it were an epiphenomenon of itself. That consciousness is a property of its structure functioning, doing what it does, putting things together. And again, one of the most conspicuous erasers of that egotistical madness was the cover of the first Whole Earth catalog put out by the Potrero Institute, a group of questers in San Francisco back in the 60s. And the caption around the photograph of the whole Earth, not a diagram of it, not a photograph of the globe of the Earth. From deep space, deep enough by the moon to get the whole Earth. And the caption was, "We cannot put it together. It is together." Our life is not an epiphenomenon on the planet. It is a grace of spirit that sparks, that transforms between consciousness and nature and makes fertile and viable and shareable qualities which are obviously cosmic. They are shareable not only for a planet in a star system, but of star systems in interstellar ranges that are galactic. Our galactic center is about 26,000 light years away, and it was unseeable because of the welter of material and distance, and the Spitzer telescope just 2 days ago was able to take the central 300 light year photo of the center of our star system. And it is the most interesting swirl of tapestry of all different kinds of forms of phenomenality that were hardly ever seen before. And the caption on it is, "The smallest dot in this huge composition is about 20 times the size of our star system." We do not need to be afraid to be real, because we are real. It is the recognition of this that is difficult, because as soon as one has the ability to write a time machine, the next correlate realization is what's going to happen to man if he can transform himself. And so the very next novel H.G. Wells wrote in 1895 was The Island of Dr. Moreau. The man who experiments by teasing animals into hyper-evolution so that they become, under his surgical knife, variants of human beings that are developed out of the animals, except they keep regressing back, and so they have to be disciplined and punished. They call the laboratory where this happens the House of Pain. And so half men, half beasts crouch in the jungles of this island because he's done so many experiments. He doesn't have time to go back for all of them. And so there are wild half creatures living in a savage tribe in the jungles, fearful only because of the punishment that Dr. Moreau has for them. As soon as Wells wrote The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, it occurred to him, because he was very interesting. He was a self-educated man. Never went to university. But he realized that there's something about the writer who writes this and now knows this, has expressed this. Readers have read that, shared this. There's something about himself that is not really seeable. And his very next novel is called The Invisible Man. If you've ever seen the Claude Rains 1930 film of The Invisible Man, it's extraordinary. He literally is unable to adapt and must be hunted. And as soon as The Invisible Man was put with Island of Dr. Moreau and with The Time Machine, the very next novel was The War of the Worlds. You can see how in every rapid year in the 1890s, Wells was turning out conscious nightmares. The 1897 novel was called When the Sleeper Awakes. A man of 1897 falls into a coma and doesn't wake up until the year 2100. And when he wakes up, he finds out that he's been their God in his coma coffin. And they don't know what to do now that God has woken up and is questioning them. The peculiarity of science fiction late in the 19th century, early in the 20th century, gained its ground until the 1960s. And in the 1960s, all of it was transmuted in such a peculiar way that it was no longer a science fiction, but it was a remembering that all of the great heritages throughout the planet, throughout every kind of human being, included these expressions of other worlds, these expressions of other dimensions, of other levels. And so by the middle of the 1960s, it was apparent. What is it that we really are and are together when we are together in that special way, that when we come to express it, other people bounce off it, and we are left with more mystery than ever? How does that happen? And it happens because of not having the capacity to recognize that one, once refined, cannot go back to a previous level and be at home there, to be secure there. You must make new communities, and there are new homes without end that are possible. In 1875, marking the centennial of the United States, because Lincoln had been killed 10 years before, there was no one to really speak for the United States as a whole. Walt Whitman wrote a little book called Democratic Vistas to remind everyone what all this is about. And in the very first paragraphs of Democratic Vistas, he said, nature shows us again and again that she regards with favor two capacities. She likes freedom and she likes variability. The old categorical imperative of a closed philosophy made into a political doctrine is that before you do anything, you have to ask yourself the question, what if everyone did this? And edit yourself on that basis. Whereas the new transformational, non-imperative is to turn that inside out and ask yourself, what if no one did this? The universe would be minus a value. Let's see what the freedom and the variability with a spiritual, prismatic visioning is able to bring forth in refinement. Nature this year, the year just passed, November 2008, celebrated the 200th anniversary of Darwin's The Origin of Species author, his birth. One of my favorite science fiction friends was A.E. Van Vogt, who did The Voyage of the Space Beagle. Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle is the seed of evolution. This is the voyage, the seed of a future evolution. For Roger Weir, all the best wishes of the author, A.E. Van Vogt. The British first edition has an interesting cover. It's about the first group of 1,000 human beings on a superior ship that is able to go outside the galaxy for the first time, and the adventures that they have. More next week.